In a small train station, a dog has been waiting 10 years for his master to return. But this isn't just a story about loyalty. It's about buried secrets, sacrifices and a truth that changed an entire town. What led John Miller to disappear? And why did Max never give up hope? Get ready for a thrilling journey that will reveal that some promises cannot be broken, even by time. Stay with us and find out what really happened. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rusty tracks of the Willow Creek train station. As on every day for the last 10 years, Max, a golden retriever with a golden coat now speckled with white, took his usual place on the worn wooden bench on the platform. His amber eyes, although a little duller with age, remained fixed on the tracks that snaked towards the horizon. "There he is again," whispered Diana Peterson to her 8-year-old daughter, as they crossed the platform on their way to school. "The most faithful dog in Willow Creek." Little Lisa squeezed her mother's hand. "Why is he always here, Mommy?" Diana hesitated, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at the old dog. "He's waiting for someone very special, dear. His owner, Mr. Miller." The name triggered vivid memories in Diana. John Miller was not just another face in the small town of 3,000 inhabitants. As a history teacher at Willow Creek High School, he had touched countless lives with his passion for teaching and his gentle smile. She herself had been his student 15 years ago. Max adjusted his position on the bench, his joints no longer as agile as before. A station employee, Robert, approached with a bowl of fresh water and a few slices of turkey. It had been part of his daily routine for years. "Here you go, buddy," Robert said softly, placing the bowls next to the dog. Max briefly looked away from the tracks to thank him with a gentle wave of his tail, before returning to his constant vigil. That same morning, in a hotel room 200 miles away, Sarah Collins was going over her notes for her next story. The 32-year-old journalist had built her reputation by telling stories that other reporters considered too small or insignificant. For her, it was precisely these stories that revealed the true essence of humanity. "Story of the dog that's been waiting at the station for 10 years, she muttered, rereading the email she'd received from a local reader. Her eyebrows arched with interest when she noticed the date of John Miller's departure, September 15, 2014. The same day she had decided to leave her hometown after a devastating fight with her father. In the Millers' old house, Emma, now 25, was sitting in the room that had once been her teenage sanctuary. The walls still bore the faded posters of bands she had long since stopped listening to. On the desk, a framed photo captured a happier time. She was 15, smiling next to her father and Max at a picnic in the park. Her fingers traced the outline of John's face on the photograph. "Why did you have to go, Dad?" she whispered into the silence of the room. The question, repeated countless times over the years, still echoed without an answer. At the station, the distant sound of an approaching train made Max's ears perk up. As happened several times a day, he straightened up, his eyes taking on a momentary gleam of expectation. The train slowed, creaking to a complete stop. Passengers got off, others boarded, but none of them was John Miller. Max watched each face carefully, as he had done for 10 years. When the last passenger left the platform, he slowly settled back into his seat. His eyes, however, never left the tracks. A few blocks away, at the Willow Creek Herald, Editor-in-Chief Benjamin Walker was rereading for the third time the email he had just received from Sarah Collins. The renowned journalist wanted to cover Max's story. His finger hovered over the mouse, hesitating before clicking reply. Benjamin had known John Miller longer than anyone else in the city. He knew secrets that he had preferred to keep under wraps all these years. Now, a determined journalist was about to unearth a story that might have been better left buried. "Sometimes the truth needs to come out," he muttered to himself, starting to type his reply. The sun was beginning to set over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Shadows lengthened on the station platform, where Max stood in silent vigil. A gentle wind ruffled his fur, bringing with it the familiar scent of railroad tracks and the ever-present promise of return. For the locals hurrying past on their way home, Max was more than just a dog. He was a living reminder that love, in its purest form, knows no limits of time or distance. And as the station lights came on one by one, marking the end of another day of waiting, Max stood his ground, the faithful guardian of an unspoken promise between a man and his best friend. The first train the next morning would arrive in a few hours. And Max would be there, as he always was, waiting. The rain was falling gently on Willow Creek when Sarah Collins stepped off the train, her suitcase banging rhythmically against the metal steps. Her eyes immediately found Max, a solitary and resilient figure against the gray sky. The old golden retriever, protected only by the small roof of the platform, kept his vigil unwaveringly. "So it's you," Sarah murmured, slowly approaching. Her years of journalism had taught her that the best stories began with silent observation. Max noticed her, but kept his eyes fixed on the tracks, as if he feared missing the exact moment when John might return. At the Willow Creek Herald, Benjamin Walker was rummaging through the paper's dusty archives. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a yellowed folder marked 2014. There it was, the last published photo of John Miller, taken during the school science fair, just 3 days before his departure. John was smiling, but his eyes carried a shadow that Benjamin could only now recognize. "You knew you weren't coming back, didn't you, John?" he murmured to the photograph. In her hotel room, Sarah was organizing her initial notes when her phone rang. It was her sister, Rachel. "Are you really going to do this?" Rachel's voice sounded worried. "Messing with people's pasts?" Sarah closed her eyes, remembering her own father and the last time she had seen him. "Some stories need to be told, Rach. Not to expose, but to heal." In the Miller's old house, Emma found a box in the attic that she hadn't opened for years. Inside, as well as old bills and documents, there was a yellowed envelope addressed to her, still unopened. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope, revealing a letter dated September 14, 2014, the day before John left. "Dear Emma, by the time you read this, it may be too late for explanations. But you deserve to know the truth. The last few months have been harder than I let on." Emma stopped reading, her tears staining the paper. 10 years of anger and confusion were starting to turn into something different, something she wasn't yet ready to name. At the station, Sarah watched Max interact with Robert, the employee who had faithfully fed him for years. The middle-aged man knelt down next to the dog, ignoring the rain that was now falling harder. "You know," Robert began, noticing Sarah's interest, "it's not just food I bring him. I bring him stories too. I tell him about the trains coming, the people passing by. Sometimes I think he understands every word." Sarah made a quick note in her notebook, but her attention was caught by something else, a small silver locket on Max's collar, almost completely worn away by time. "May I?" she asked Robert, who nodded. Approaching carefully, Sarah examined the locket. The inscription, although worn, was still legible: "Max and John Miller, Forever Friends, 2008. On the back, there was something else, a partially erased telephone number. At that same moment, in a hospital 200 miles away, a nurse called Catherine Reynolds was organizing old files when she came across a folder with a familiar name, John Miller. She stopped, remembering the patient who had arrived so long ago, carrying only a backpack and a crumpled train ticket. Back in Willow Creek, the rain finally stopped, leaving the characteristic smell of wet earth in the air. Sarah decided to follow her instincts and visit the school where John taught. In the main hallway, a display case of trophies and honors included a photo of him receiving the Teacher of the Year award in 2013. "He was different from the other teachers," a voice said behind her. It was Diana Peterson, now also a teacher at the school. John had a unique way of making history come alive. Max used to come to class with him, you know. He'd sit quietly at the back of the room, as if he was learning too. Sarah noticed how Diana's eyes filled with tears as she spoke of her old classmate. "Were you here when he left?" Diana hesitated, her gaze lingering on the memories. "Yes, and it was strange. John was always so dedicated he never missed a class. Then, that morning, he just didn't show up. Max stayed at the station all day. We thought he'd be back the next day, but—" Diana's voice faltered. Sarah gently touched her arm, realizing that there was much more to the story than just an unexplained departure. Later that afternoon, as the sun set over Willow Creek, Sarah returned to the station. Max was still at his post, his silhouette jagged against the orange sky. She sat down next to him on the bench, keeping an appropriate distance. "What do you know that we don't, buddy?" she whispered, watching the track stretching to the horizon. "What happened that day?" Max turned his head slightly in her direction, his amber eyes carrying a silent wisdom that Sarah still couldn't decipher. In her notebook, she jotted down, "Sometimes silence tells deeper stories than words." Dawn found Sarah sitting at her makeshift desk at the Willow Creek Herald, surrounded by piles of old newspapers. Benjamin had given her access to the archives on one condition: "Be gentle with the truth," he had said, his words carrying a weight that Sarah was still trying to understand. Her eyes wandered over a report from 2014 about financial problems at the local school when something caught her eye. A small note, almost hidden on page 6, "School emergency fund disappears, investigation underway." The date, September 13, 2014, 2 days before John's departure. In the Miller's kitchen, Emma held her father's letter with trembling hands, finally plucking up the courage to continue reading. "The last few months have been harder than I let on. The bank is about to take our house, Emma. Your college fees, your mother's treatments before she left, my debts, everything has piled up. But I've found a way to put things right. I need to take a trip. When I get back, I promise everything will be sorted out." Emma dropped the letter, memories flooding her mind. The nights she'd found her father huddled over the kitchen table, surrounded by bills. The whispered conversations on the phone. The way he began to avoid certain people in the city. In the distant hospital, Catherine Reynolds decided to do something she technically shouldn't have. After her shift, she went through the hospital's old archives, looking for more information about John Miller. The admission record showed something intriguing: he had been admitted as John Doe, without identification. Back in Willow Creek, Sarah walked through town with Max by her side. The old dog had inexplicably decided to accompany her that morning, temporarily abandoning his post at the station. It was as if he knew she was close to something important. "Mr. Miller was a private man," explained Agnes Cooper, the school's former secretary, as she served tea on her balcony. "But in that last month, something changed. He started arriving earlier, leaving later. Once, late at night, I saw lights in the administration office. He was there, alone." Sarah made a mental note, connecting the dots. "What about the school's emergency fund? I heard something about a disappearance." Agnes tensed. $50,000. They disappeared the same week as John. Many have made the connection, but she looked at Max, who was resting patiently at her feet. How could someone capable of inspiring such loyalty be dishonest? At the local bank, Sarah found more pieces of the puzzle. With the help of an older employee, she discovered that John had closed his account 2 days before he left, withdrawing all the cash. "He seemed nervous," recalled the employee. "He said something about having to fix a mistake." Meanwhile, in her apartment in Boston, Sarah's sister Rachel found an old online report about rail accidents from 2014. One in particular caught her eye: a minor derailment, with no fatalities, but with one crucial detail: a briefcase containing $50,000 in cash was found in the wreckage, but the owner was never identified. At the station, Robert shared with Sarah a memory he had never told anyone. That morning, before leaving, Mr. Miller came earlier than usual. He knelt down next to Max and talked to him for a long time. I couldn't hear everything, but one sentence stuck with me: "Take care of Emma until I get back, buddy." Sarah watched Max, who had returned to his usual post. The afternoon sun illuminated his golden fur, highlighting the white strands that time had colored. On his neck, the worn medallion glowed softly. That night, after hours of sifting through records and connecting information, Sarah sat in her hotel room, spreading her notes out on the bed. A pattern was beginning to emerge, not of a dishonest man fleeing with stolen money, but of someone desperate to protect those he loved. His phone rang. It was Catherine, the nurse. "I found something you need to see," she said, her voice urgent. In his belongings, there was a letter. It was never sent. It's addressed to someone called Benjamin Walker. Sarah felt her heart race. Benjamin, the editor who had given her access to the archives, who had known John for so long. Who kept secrets he preferred to keep buried. At home, Emma fell asleep with her father's letter on her chest, tears drying on her cheeks. On the bedside table, an old photo showed 3 smiling figures, her, John and Max, in simpler times. The glass of the picture frame reflected the moonlight, creating a soft glow that seemed to dance over their faces frozen in time. And at the station, as always, Max kept his vigil. His eyes were tired but still alert, fixed on the tracks that disappeared into the darkness. The night was silent, except for the occasional hoot of an owl and the whisper of the wind between the trees. In its solitary post, it seemed to carry not only the hope of its owner's return, but also the weight of a truth not yet revealed. The letter that Catherine found in the hospital arrived in Sarah's hands on a gray autumn morning. The paper was yellowed, folded carefully inside an envelope that had never been sealed. The handwriting trembled slightly, as if written in a hurry or under great emotional stress. "Dear Ben, by the time you read this, they will probably have found me. Things didn't go according to plan. The money, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I needed to give it back before they found out, but now. Protect Emma. Tell her that every decision, every choice I've made." The letter ended abruptly, as if John had been interrupted. Sarah looked out of the window of her hotel room, watching the golden leaves dancing in the wind. John's words seemed to dance in the same way, carrying meanings that she was still struggling to understand. In the newspaper office, Benjamin was restless. Ever since Sarah had started her investigation, old memories had been haunting him more frequently. Especially that last conversation with John, on the evening of September 14th, "I need you to understand, Ben," John had said, his voice low and urgent in the empty office. "If something goes wrong if I don't come back." "What are you talking about, John?" Benjamin asked, but in his heart, he already knew. In the present, Benjamin opened his lowest drawer, removing a false bottom he had kept for 10 years. There it was, a fat, sealed envelope with the word "evidence" written in red. At the miller's house, Emma found something that would change everything. Hidden inside an old history book, the subject her father loved to teach so much, was a diary. The pages revealed a truth she had never imagined: her father had discovered serious irregularities in the school's administration. The disappearance of the emergency fund was no ordinary theft, but part of a much larger scheme. "I can't stand by and watch them destroy these children's futures," said one entry. "The money they took isn't just money, it's dreams, opportunities, futures." Sarah, following her intuition, visited the local library. In the newspaper archives of neighboring towns, she found something revealing. 3 months before John's departure, a school in a nearby town had experienced a similar scandal. The person responsible for exposing the corruption? An anonymous teacher. "He was gathering evidence," Sarah muttered to herself. "He wasn't stealing the money, he was trying to protect it." At the station, Max received a special visitor. Emma, after years of avoiding the place, finally found the courage to sit down next to her father's old friend. Her hands trembled as she stroked the soft fur, now more white than golden. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she whispered. "I knew he hadn't abandoned us by choice." Max leaned his head on Emma's knee, his wise eyes seeming to say, "I always knew." Catherine, at the hospital, continued her search through the files. John's entry as John Doe had a curious annotation: patient found with partially burnt documents and a water-damaged suitcase. Sarah received this information with a shudder. The train crash, the briefcase with money, the burnt documents, the pieces were beginning to fit together in a dark puzzle. Benjamin, after hours of contemplation, finally made his decision. He called Sarah. "Come to the paper tonight," he said, his voice laden with resignation. "There's something you need to see. Something I've kept for 10 years. Meanwhile, at Willow Creek Town Hall, a former school administration official, Caroline Winters, was watching Sarah's investigations with growing concern. In her drawer, an old yellowed newspaper clipping reported the suicide of the school's former finance director, just a month after John's departure. At the station, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Max, as always, stood his ground. But there was something different about his posture, a subtle tension, as if he too sensed that long-buried truths were about to surface. Robert, bringing Max his dinner, noticed the change. "You feel something different, don't you, buddy?" he murmured, kneeling down beside the dog. Maybe it's time the truth finally came out." Sarah, preparing for her meeting with Benjamin, reread her notes one last time. In her notebook, one sentence stood out: "Sometimes the greatest act of love is leaving to protect those we love." Night fell over Willow Creek, bringing with it the promise of long-awaited revelations. In the silence of the station, Max stood at his post, guardian not only of memories, but of a truth that would soon forever change the way everyone remembered John Miller. The Willow Creek Herald office was plunged into shadows when Sarah arrived. Only the light from Benjamin's desk illuminated the room, creating a yellowish circle that seemed to isolate him from the rest of the world. On his desk, the envelope marked "Evidence" waited, the silent guardian of long-buried secrets. "Before I show you this," Benjamin began, his voice hoarse, "I need you to understand something about John. He wasn't just a teacher. He was a man who believed that doing the right thing was worth any sacrifice." With trembling hands, Benjamin opened the envelope. Inside were financial documents, printed emails and, most significantly, a series of photos. The images showed secret meetings between the former finance director, David Andrews, and various local businessmen. John discovered that the school's emergency fund was just the tip of the iceberg, Benjamin explained, spreading out the documents. For years, David and his associates had been embezzling money intended for scholarships, extracurricular programs, even school lunches. Meanwhile, in the Millers' old house, Emma continued her immersion in her father's diary. One entry in particular made her freeze: "September 12, 2014. I got the final exams today. The scam is bigger than I imagined. It's not just our school, it's every school in the county. Millions in embezzlement over the years. David saw me in the office. The way he looked, he knows I know." At the police station, Detective Richard Torres, recently transferred to Willow Creek, was receiving an unexpected visitor. Caroline Winters, visibly shaking, had decided to speak up. "I couldn't carry this any longer," she said, placing a folder on the table. "John Miller didn't steal that money. He took it to protect it, because he knew that David was planning to make his last big detour before disappearing." At the hospital, Catherine made a crucial discovery in John's belongings. Between the scorched pages of a history book, she found a partially burnt note: "D. Plans to eliminate evidence. Final transfer scheduled. I need to get there first." Sarah, still at the newspaper with Benjamin, felt her heart squeeze with each new revelation. "Why did you keep this for so long?" Benjamin closed his eyes, guilt weighing on his words. "John came to me that last night. He said he had a plan to expose everything, but he needed time. He asked me to keep the evidence in case something went wrong. And it did, Sarah added softly. The train John was on, Benjamin continued, didn't derail by accident. I found out years later that the brakes had been tampered with. But without hard evidence, without a body. At the station, Max suddenly raised his head, as if sensing the change in the air. Robert, making his last rounds of the night, noticed something different about the old dog. "What is it, buddy?" he asked, kneeling down next to Max. The golden retriever was staring at the tracks, but not with his usual hopeful expectation. There was something else in his eyes, a deep understanding, as if he had always known that his vigil was not for John's return, but for the truth that his owner had fought so hard to reveal. Emma, driving through the rainy night, arrived at the station with her father's diary clutched tightly against her chest. When she saw Max, her eyes filled with tears of understanding. "You weren't just waiting, were you?" she whispered, kneeling down beside the dog. "You were guarding his place, keeping alive the memory of what he tried to do." At the newspaper office, Sarah found one last revelation in Benjamin's papers. A list of names, children who had lost their scholarships because of the embezzlement. Among them, highlighted in red, was the name of Leslie Andrews, David's daughter. John discovered that even David's own daughter had been harmed, Benjamin explained. That's what made him realize that he needed to act, no matter what the cost. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. John Miller was not a thief running away with stolen money. He was a desperate man racing against time, trying to expose a conspiracy that was harming hundreds of children. A man who, in the end, paid the ultimate price for his integrity. Sarah looked out of the newspaper window towards the station. Even at that time of night, she knew that Max would be there, keeping his eternal vigil. No longer a symbol of endless waiting, but a living memorial to loyalty, courage and sacrifice. Some stories, she thought, writing in her notebook, are not about what we lose, but about what remains. Not about absence, but about constant presence. Not about departures, but about the courage to stay and keep the truth until it can finally come to light. At the station, under the soft light of the street lamps, Max stood at his post. His silver fur shone softly, like a beacon in the darkness, guiding the way to a truth that, for 10 long years, had been waiting patiently to be discovered. The next morning dawned with a dense fog over Willow Creek, as if nature itself was trying to protect the town from the truths that were emerging. Emma woke up in her old bed, her father's diary still hugged to her chest. For the first time in 10 years, her tears were not of anger or abandonment, but of painful, belated pride. In the Miller's kitchen, Sarah made coffee while Emma shared more details of her father's notes. "He kept a list," Emma said, her voice breaking. "Every child who missed an opportunity, every program cut, every dream interrupted. They weren't just numbers to him." On the other side of town, Leslie Andrews, now 28, received an unexpected visit from Detective Torres. When she learned that her own father had sabotaged her chance at a scholarship, her world fell apart. "John Miller tried to protect me," she asked in disbelief. "All these years, I thought he was the villain of the story." At the police station, Caroline Winters continued her confession. Her words painted a devastating picture of years of manipulation and fear. "David Andrews had something on each of us," she explained, her hands shaking as she held a glass of water. "But John was different. He had nothing to hide, and that made him dangerous." Catherine, in the distant hospital, was making one last crucial discovery. Among John's belongings, she found a damaged USB stick. With the help of the hospital's IT team, they managed to recover some of its contents, detailed spreadsheets, bank transfers, a complex network of offshore accounts. "He's mapped it all out," Catherine murmured, amazed at the extent of John's investigation. In Willow Creek, the news was beginning to spread. Benjamin had published a first, carefully worded story about the initial findings. The town, which for years had divided opinion on John Miller, was now forced to confront a painful truth. Diana Peterson organized an emergency meeting at the school. Past and present teachers gathered in the auditorium, many of whom had worked with John. He always said that education was about more than grades, Diana shared, her voice echoing in the silent space. It was about giving every child a fair chance to dream. Robert, after leaving Max's breakfast at the station, found something that had gone unnoticed for a decade. Behind the bench where Max kept his vigil, partially covered by years of exposure to the weather, was a small symbol carved into the wood, J.M., the truth always finds its way home. Sarah, watching the town awaken to this new reality, realized that the story she had come to tell had turned into something much bigger. It wasn't just about a dog who waited faithfully for his master, but about how loyalty and truth, like Max, could remain unshakable in the face of time and adversity. Emma spent the afternoon at the station, sitting next to Max together. They watched the trains arrive and depart, each carrying their own load of stories and secrets. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she whispered to Max. "I knew he was a hero." The old dog leaned his head on Emma's shoulder, his wise eyes reflecting a truth that words could never adequately express. In the evening, Sarah found Benjamin at the newspaper again. The editor seemed to have aged a decade in a single day, the weight of his secret finally lifted from his shoulders. "You know what's ironic?" he said, looking out of the window towards the station. "John always said that the most important story is the one nobody wants to tell. And here we are, 10 years later, discovering that the most important story in Willow Creek was being told silently every day, by a dog that refused to give up." At City Hall, the lights stayed on late. Employees combed through old files, now with fresh eyes. Detective Torres was coordinating a special task force, following the money trail that John had started mapping a decade ago. Max, at his usual post, looked different that night. His posture, always alert, now carried a new dignity. He was no longer just a dog waiting for his master, but a guardian of the truth, a living symbol that some things, love, loyalty, integrity, are truly eternal. The full moon illuminated the station, casting long shadows across the tracks. Somewhere in the night, a train whistled in the distance, its sound echoing through the valley like a musical lament. It was as if the town itself was finally crying for John Miller, not as a man who had abandoned it, but as a hero who had sacrificed everything to protect it. Autumn was painting Willow Creek in shades of red and gold when the first national headline broke the story: corruption, sacrifice and a faithful dog, the untold story of John Miller. Sarah's article, published first in the local paper and then reproduced nationwide, triggered an avalanche of reactions. At the Miller's house, Emma hung up the phone for the 10th time that morning. Journalists from all over the country wanted to hear her story, to turn her pain into sensationalist headlines. Outside, some were already camped out, cameras in hand, hoping to capture the perfect moment of suffering or redemption. "They don't understand," she said to Max, who had temporarily abandoned his post at the station to stand by her side. "It's not a story about scandals or corruption. It's about love, about doing the right thing even when it costs everything." At the FBI office in Boston, a special task force was analyzing the documents recovered by Catherine. Special Agent Daniel Rodriguez was impressed by the thoroughness of John's investigation. In 10 years of work, he commented to his team, "I've never seen a civilian document a conspiracy so thoroughly. This man wasn't just a teacher, he was a born investigator." Leslie Andrews, still processing the revelations about her father, decided to do something meaningful. With Sarah's help, she began tracking down other students who had lost their opportunities due to the corruption scheme. "I want to set up a foundation," she explained, her voice steady despite her tears. "In the name of John Miller. To give these children the second chance that my father took away from them." At the police station, Detective Torres was making a disturbing discovery. David Andrews' phone records in the weeks before John's disappearance showed several calls to a specific number, belonging to an ex-con known for special jobs. "The train crash," Torres muttered, connecting the dots. It wasn't just sabotage. It was an assassination attempt. Catherine, still going through the hospital archives, found something that broke her heart. In the first few weeks after being admitted as John Doe, even in a coma, John had repeatedly muttered two names, Emma and Max. In Willow Creek, the community mobilized in unexpected ways. Diana Peterson organized a campaign to create a student emergency fund, aptly named the John Miller Fund for Equal Education. In just 1 week, donations exceeded the original amount embezzled. Robert, the station employee, noticed a change in Max's visitors. They were no longer just locals bringing snacks and affection. People were traveling from far and wide to meet the dog who had become a national symbol of loyalty and perseverance. "It's funny," he commented to Sarah, watching a group of children leave flowers on the bench at the station. For years, people saw Max as a sad story. Now they realized that he was never a victim, he was a guardian. Benjamin, facing his own internal battles, decided to retire from the paper. His last issue as editor-in-chief would be devoted entirely to the story of John and Max. "For 10 years, I have carried the weight of silence," he wrote in his final editorial. "Today, I hand over this newspaper to a new generation of journalists, with a lesson learned the hard way: the truth, like Max's loyalty, knows no expiration date." Emma, inspired by her father's courage, began to organize the documents and memories she had found. With Sarah's help, she planned to write a book, not just about the scandal, but about the man behind it. "I want people to know my father," she explained, leafing through the worn diary. "Not the hero the newspapers are portraying, but the man who read stories to me every night, who rescued Max from a shelter, who believed that every child deserved a fair chance." At the station, as dusk fell, Max kept his vigil with renewed dignity. His fur, now more white than golden, shone in the light of the setting sun. A small bronze plaque had been installed on the bench, "Here waits Max," reminding us daily that some truths are worth a lifetime of devotion. Sarah, watching the old dog from her makeshift desk at the newspaper, realized that her story had become something much bigger than herself. It wasn't just about exposing a scandal or claiming belated justice. It was about how loyalty, whether that of a dog to its master or a man to his principles, could inspire generations. Night fell softly over Willow Creek, bringing with it a breeze that stirred the golden leaves of fall. At the station, Max adjusted his position on the bench, his wise eyes reflecting the first stars. The truth about John Miller had finally come to light, but Max's vigil continued, no longer in waiting, but in eternal witness to a love that transcended time and death itself. The first cold of winter arrived in Willow Creek along with a disturbing discovery. Agent Rodriguez, rummaging through old bank records, found a series of suspicious transfers to an account in the Cayman Islands, all made in the weeks leading up to John's disappearance. "The interesting thing," he explained to Sarah and Detective Torres in a video conference, "is that these transfers were made from David Andrews' personal computer, but using John Miller's credentials." At the Miller's house, Emma found a box hidden in the lining of her father's closet. Inside, as well as more documents, there was something unexpected: a registered gun and a note dated September 13, 2014. "If you're reading this, Emma, it means something has gone wrong. Andrews threatened me today. I have no choice but to act now. The gun is just precautionary, you know me, I could never use it." Emma dropped the note, her hands shaking. Max, who rarely left the station now, was by her side, as if he sensed her distress. Catherine, at the hospital, was making one last attempt to retrieve information from the days John had been in hospital. A retired nurse, Louise Matthews, remembered something crucial. He had a visitor, Louise revealed over the phone. A man who only stayed for a few minutes. When he left, John's heart monitor showed significant agitation. The next day, he got dramatically worse. Detective Torres, following this new lead, discovered a blurred image of the mysterious visitor on the hospital's security cameras. The date, 3 days after the train crash. "It can't be," he muttered, magnifying the image. The man was wearing a hat and sunglasses, but his posture was unmistakable. It was David Andrews. In Boston, Leslie Andrews was facing his own demons. Going through her father's belongings after his death, she found a USB stick hidden in a fake book spine. Inside was a video file. "It's a confession," she told Sarah over the phone, her voice breaking. "He recorded everything before he took his own life. He talks about John, about the money, about the accident. Sarah, he had the train sabotaged, but he didn't want John to die. It was just to scare him, to make him give up." At the station, Robert noticed something different about Max that morning. The old dog seemed more agitated, his eyes fixed on a point far from the tracks. "What do you see, buddy?" Robert asked softly. As if in answer, a freight train passed slowly through the station. It was the same model as that fateful September day 10 years ago. Benjamin, in his last week as editor, received an unexpected visit. A former employee of the railway company brought with him a never-published report on the accident. The sabotage was amateurish, the man explained. It was done to cause a minor derailment. But something went wrong. The train reached a higher speed than expected on the curve. Sarah, connecting all the new information, began to see a pattern emerge. John hadn't simply uncovered corruption, he was about to expose a network that extended far beyond Willow Creek. Emma, still processing the discovery of the weapon, decided to visit the station. Sitting next to Max, she reread all her father's notes. He never planned to use that gun, she realized, tears running free. It was more like proof. He knew Andrews had an unregistered arsenal. He was documenting everything. At the FBI, the investigation was taking a broader turn. The school corruption scheme was just part of a larger money laundering operation that involved several cities in the state. John Miller stumbled into something much bigger than he imagined, Agent Rodriguez concluded. And he paid the price for his integrity. At night, as the snow began to fall softly over Willow Creek, Max kept his usual vigil. But there was something different about his posture, a calm certainty, as if each new revelation about his owner only confirmed what he had always known. Sarah, watching the old dog from the newspaper window, finally understood the true meaning of her wait. Max wasn't just waiting for an impossible return, he was guarding a truth that, like the snow that now covered the city, had many layers yet to be revealed. Loyalty, she wrote in her notebook, is sometimes not about waiting for the impossible, but about protecting the memory of those who sacrificed everything for the truth. Winter tightened its embrace on Willow Creek as the FBI's investigation reached a crucial point. In a room full of evidence in the Boston office, Agent Rodriguez set up a panel that connected dozens of photographs, documents and financial reports. In the center, the photo of John Miller, the last known, taken at the train station on that fateful September day. "What we've uncovered goes far beyond embezzlement of school funds," he explained to Sarah during a protected video call. John had uncovered a money laundering ring that used schools in 5 different states as a front. Emma, who was participating in the call from Benjamin's office, felt her heart squeeze. Each new revelation about the extent of her father's investigation made her loss even deeper and more significant. In the Andrews' old house, Leslie made a disturbing discovery while organizing her father's last belongings. In a safe hidden behind a painting, she found a folder marked "Contingency." Inside were dozens of surveillance photos, John with Emma at school, John walking with Max, John at school meetings. "He was watching him," Leslie whispered in horror to Sarah on the phone. "My father, he practically stalked John." Catherine, still in the distant hospital, finally gained access to a sealed file on John's last days. The medical records revealed something intriguing. Even in a coma, his vital signs reacted significantly when Max was mentioned in the conversations around him. "It's as if, even unconscious, he knew Max was waiting for him," she commented to Emma during an emotional phone call. At the station, Max was facing his own battle. The intense winter cold made it harder for his aging arthritis to keep its usual vigil. Robert, concerned, installed a small heated house next to the bench, but Max refused to use it, preferring to keep his usual post. "Some call it stubbornness," Robert explained to a group of visitors. "I call it honor." Detective Torres, following the trail of the mysterious visitor at the hospital, made a surprising connection. Security cameras at a nearby gas station showed David Andrews meeting someone 2 hours after his visit to John, an influential politician who, years later, would be investigated for fraud in education contracts. It wasn't just about silencing John, Torres realized. It was about protecting an entire corrupt system. Sarah, delving deeper and deeper into the investigation, began to understand the true weight that John carried. In his personal notes, found on the recovered flash drive, he had mapped connections between shell companies, corrupt politicians and school officials in dozens of districts. "Every penny embezzled," he had written, "is a child's stolen dream. I can't stand by and watch it happen." Emma, inspired by her father's courage, made a significant decision. With Leslie's help, she began to organize a national conference on transparency in education funding. "We're going to call it Project Max," she announced during a meeting with local educators. "Because just as Max keeps his tireless vigil, we need to keep our vigil over those who should be protecting our children's future." Benjamin, in his last days as editor, received an anonymous letter that would change everything. It was from a former member of the corruption scheme, detailing how the network had developed over the years and confirming that John was about to expose everything when he was silenced. In the evening, as the snow fell silently over Willow Creek, a small group gathered at the station. Emma, Sarah, Leslie, Benjamin, Robert and others who had been touched by John and Max's story. No words or ceremony, just sharing space with the old dog that had become the moral heart of the town. Max, as always, kept his eyes on the tracks, his breath forming little clouds in the cold air. But there was something different about his posture, a serenity that seemed to say that, even with all the painful revelations, the truth his owner had fought for was finally coming out. Sarah, watching the scene, understood that she was witnessing something greater than a simple story of corruption and justice. It was a testament to the power of unconditional love, unwavering loyalty and the truth that, like the snow that kept falling, covered everything with its silent purity. For 10 years, she wrote in her notebook, a dog kept not only the memory of his master, but also the truth that he died trying to protect. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are those that happen in silence, day after day, without applause or recognition. Just pure, tireless devotion. The first Project Max conference took place on a freezing January morning in the auditorium of Willow Creek High School. The venue was packed, educators, journalists, investigators and families affected by the corruption scheme had traveled from all corners of the country to attend. On stage, Emma Miller stood next to a large photograph of her father. The image, taken during his last class, showed John smiling as he explained something to his students, Max sleeping peacefully at the back of the room. "My father used to say that education is more than knowledge," Emma began, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "It's about hope, about giving every child the chance to dream big. Today, we found out that he died protecting those dreams." Agent Rodriguez took the stage next, presenting the official findings of the FBI investigation. The corruption ring had embezzled more than $50 million of education funds over the course of a decade, affecting thousands of students in several states. John Miller was not just a teacher, Rodriguez declared. He was a hero who gave his life to expose one of the biggest corruption schemes in the history of American education. In the audience, Leslie Andrews listened with a mixture of shame and determination. Next to her, a folder contained donation documents. She was turning her entire inheritance into the initial scholarship fund for Project Max. Catherine, who had traveled especially for the event, shared her part of the story. John's last weeks in hospital took on new meaning in the light of recent discoveries. "He fought to the end," she explained, showing the medical records. Even in a coma, his body reacted to Max's name, as if he knew there was someone faithfully waiting for him to return. Sarah, watching everything from her seat at the back of the auditorium, realized that her story had become something much bigger than herself. It wasn't just about corruption or justice, it was about love, loyalty, and the power of truth to transform lives. Outside, in the snow-covered station, Max kept his usual vigil. Robert had managed to convince him to wear a coat specially made for old dogs, but nothing could move him from his post. During a break in the conference, Emma walked to the station. She sat down next to Max, as she had done so many times in recent months. "You know what's funny, Max?" she whispered, stroking his gray hair. "For years, I thought you were waiting for Dad to come back. Now I understand that you were guarding something much more precious, the truth from him." Benjamin, now officially retired from the newspaper, spent the morning organizing a special exhibition in the school lobby. Photos, documents and headlines told the story not just of the scandal, but of the transformation of a community. "Some stories changed the way we see the world," he explained to a group of visitors. "This one changed the way we see each other." Detective Torres received an important call during the conference. The police had tracked down the man hired to sabotage the train. After years consumed by guilt, he was ready to confess. It was never supposed to be fatal, he revealed in his taped statement, which Torres shared with Emma and Sarah later. Andrews said it was just to scare him, to make him give up. But something went wrong, the train was going faster than normal on that curve. In the afternoon, as the conference drew to a close, a long queue of people formed at the station. One by one, they left flowers, letters and small mementos on the bench where Max kept his vigil. Each object told a story, a lost scholarship, a cancelled educational program, a dream deferred. At dusk, as the last people left the city, Sarah met Emma again at the station. Together, they watched Max, who remained alert at his post, the snowflakes dancing gently around him. "Do you think he knows?" Emma asked softly. "That now everyone knows the truth about Dad?" Sarah watched Max's wise eyes, which reflected the soft lights of the season. "I think he always knew. That's why he never left this place." It wasn't about waiting, it was about remembering, about keeping alive the story his father died trying to tell. The snow continued to fall silently over Willow Creek, covering the town in a pure white blanket. At the station, Max adjusted his position on the bench, his old body protected by his warm coat, his eyes still fixed on the tracks that disappeared into the darkness. And there, on that winter's night, the old dog seemed to carry not only the weight of his own loyalty, but also the memory of a man who chose to do the right thing, no matter the cost. A man who, through the unconditional love of his dog, continued to teach his last and most important lesson, that some truths are worth any sacrifice. The end of January brought with it the worst snowfall Willow Creek had seen in decades. The wind howled across the station's empty tracks, piling up snow in mounds that looked like little white mountains. For Max, now 15, each day became a greater challenge than the last. Robert was the first to notice the changes. The old golden retriever, always so punctual in his vigil, began to arrive a little later each morning, his steps slower, more careful. "He's barely touched his food today," Robert commented worriedly to Emma, who now visited the station daily. And last night, for the first time in 10 years, he agreed to sleep in the heated cottage. Emma knelt down beside Max, noticing how his fur, now almost completely white, had lost much of the golden sheen it once had. His eyes, although still attentive to the tracks, seemed more tired, more distant. The local veterinarian, Dr. Wilson, made regular visits to the station, monitoring the health of the dog that had become a national symbol. "Age is taking its toll," he explained gently after an examination. "The intense cold doesn't help. His joints are very compromised, and there are signs that his heart is weaker." Sarah, who had planned to return to New York after completing her series of reports, decided to postpone her departure. There was something about the way Max looked at the tracks now, a silent urgency that she couldn't ignore. One particularly cold morning, Emma found something special among her father's belongings, a home video she had never seen before. In the shaky footage, John was playing with a much younger Max in the miller's backyard, teaching him tricks and laughing when the dog preferred rolling in the grass to obeying commands. "You know, Emma," John's voice sounded clear in the video, "some would say it was luck to find such a special dog. But I think it was Max who found us. There's something in his eyes, a wisdom, a loyalty that goes beyond what we can understand." Leslie, who was present when Emma watched the video, noticed something significant. "The way your father looks at Max in this video," she commented softly, "is the same way Max has looked at the tracks all these years. It's more than love or loyalty. It's as if you both know something that the rest of us are only just beginning to understand." At the station, now transformed into a kind of sanctuary, people continued to arrive every day, despite the intense cold. They brought blankets, special food and letters of thanks. One elderly woman from Minnesota traveled 3 days just to be able to sit quietly next to Max for a few hours. "I lost my husband 30 years ago," she explained to Sarah. "And every day since then, I've wished I had the courage of this dog, to love so openly, so completely, without fear of what others might think." Benjamin, although retired, continued to document everything. His photos of Max in the snow, especially one in which the old dog seemed to gaze at the horizon with an almost human dignity, were published in newspapers all over the country. One night, during a particularly strong storm, Max struggled to get up from his post. Robert and Emma had to help him walk to the heated cottage. It was the first time anyone had seen him whimper in pain. Catherine, informed about Max's condition, sent something surprising from the hospital, an old blanket from the room where John had been admitted. "I found it in the archives," she explained over the phone. "It was marked as a personal belonging to John Doe. Maybe Max can smell him." When Emma put the blanket in Max's little house, something extraordinary happened. The old dog, who had hardly moved all day, suddenly raised his head, his nostrils twitching slightly. For a moment, his eyes shone with that ancient light, as if something long lost had momentarily been found. Sarah, observing the scene, realized that she was witnessing not just the end of a story, but the culmination of something much deeper. In her notebook, she wrote, "There is a kind of love that transcends our understanding, that defies time and distance, that remains unshakable in the face of the greatest storms. Max isn't just waiting, he's teaching us how to love like that." And perhaps that was the true purpose of his long vigil. The snow continued to fall over Willow Creek, softer now, as if nature itself was trying to be kind to its most faithful guardian. Max, wrapped in the blanket that still carried a distant echo of its owner, slept in his warm little house. But his body was positioned in such a way that, even at rest, his eyes remained on the tracks, faithful to the end, to the silent promise made so long ago. On a quiet February morning, Robert arrived at the station earlier than usual. Something had woken him up, a restlessness he couldn't explain. He found Max already at his usual post, sitting on the bench as he had done for so many years, his eyes fixed on the tracks disappearing into the dawn mist. "There's something different about you today, buddy," Robert murmured, noticing how the old dog seemed more alert than in recent days, as if he was waiting for something special. Emma received Robert's call as she was preparing for another day's work on Project Max, which was now helping hundreds of students across the country. "Come to the station," was all he said, but there was something in his voice that made her drop everything immediately. The sun was slowly rising over Willow Creek when Emma reached the platform. The snow from the day before had stopped, leaving everything covered in a pristine white blanket. Max looked different, there was a light in his eyes that she hadn't seen for a long time, an energy that seemed to defy his advanced age. Sarah, who was planning to leave that morning, also felt she should pay one last visit to the station. She found Benjamin already there, his old camera in hand, as if he too knew that something significant was about to happen. "Look at him," Benjamin whispered, indicating Max with a gentle gesture. "It's as if he knows something we don't." The first train of the morning was delayed due to snow on the tracks. The delay created a special silence in the station, broken only by the soft sound of Max's breathing and the occasional tinkling of the wind chimes that someone had hung on the platform. It was in this moment of stillness that Emma finally understood. Kneeling beside Max, she saw in his eyes not the sadness of waiting, but the peace of a mission accomplished. "You can rest now," she whispered, her tears falling silently. "The truth is safe. Everyone knows who he was, what he did." As if responding to her words, Max gently leaned his head on Emma's shoulder. His body, although tired, still retained that dignity that had characterized him for all these years. The distant sound of a train cut through the morning air. Max raised his head, his ears moving slightly, a gesture so familiar that it made everyone's heart squeeze. Sarah, realizing the importance of the moment, began to write in her notebook one last time. "At Willow Creek Station, on a February morning, we witnessed the end of a vigil that had lasted 10 years. But it's not a sad end, it's the conclusion of a love story so pure, so true, that it changed everyone who knew it forever." The train was slowly approaching the station, its headlights cutting through the morning mist. Max stood up, with a strength that no one expected him to still possess. His eyes, bright and clear, fixed on the tracks one last time. Emma held her hand in front of her mouth, holding back a sob, as Max gently laid his head on her lap. There was no fear or sadness in his eyes, just that deep peace of someone who has fulfilled their mission to the end. "Are you going to find Daddy now?" she whispered, stroking his snow-white fur that covered the city. Max closed his eyes slowly, a last soft sigh escaping his tired body. The train passed through the station, its whistle sounding like a solemn farewell. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. The sun, emerging fully over the horizon, broke through the clouds, creating a beam of golden light that directly illuminated the spot where Max lay. For an instant, his hair glowed with that golden hue of his youth, as if time had come back. The news spread quickly through the city. People started arriving at the station, bringing flowers and souvenirs. Children who had grown up watching Max at his faithful post, adults who had found inspiration in his devotion, all came to pay their last respects. A week later, the whole town gathered for a special ceremony. On the exact spot where Max had kept his vigil, a bronze statue was installed, a seated golden retriever, gazing eternally at the tracks. At the base, a simple inscription, "Max Miller 2008-2024 Guardian of Truth, Symbol of Loyalty." "Some stories have no end, they live forever in our hearts." The Max Project continued to grow, touching more and more lives. John and Max's story was turned into a book by Sarah, then into a movie, inspiring people all over the world with its message of unconditional love and moral courage. Emma, visiting the station years later, always found fresh flowers at the foot of the statue. People kept coming, telling the story to their children, finding strength in the example of loyalty and love that transcended time. And on silent mornings, when the mist covered the tracks and the first train approached, the oldest residents of Willow Creek swore they could see, for a brief moment, the silhouette of a man and his dog walking together on the platform, finally reunited in eternity. Some stories, Sarah wrote in the last lines of her book, are not about the waiting, but about the love that makes the waiting meaningful. Max didn't wait in vain, he turned his vigil into a beacon of hope, showing the world that true love, whether of a dog for its master or a man for his principles, never really dies. It just changes form, living on forever in the stories we tell and the lives we touch. And so, in the small town of Willow Creek, the story of Max and John Miller lives on, not as a story of loss, but as an eternal testament to the power of love, loyalty and truth which, like the stars in the sky, shine brightest on the darkest nights.